Kyle is an American aerospace engineer recently widowed by the death of her husband in Berlin. She has to take her husband's body on a flight to the US with her 4-year-old daughter, Julia. To help her cope with her anxiety, Kyle takes medication as prescribed by her doctor. The next morning, it is snowing outside, and a taxi is waiting for them to take them to the airport. While at the airport, Kyle loses Julia, and she panics. She scans the crowd, seeing strangers, couples, foreigners, adults, but nobody kid-sized. She turns again and spots Julia over by a sundry stand. With a stern tone, she advises her not to wander around without her permission. Kyle and Julia soon board a plane that Kyle helped design. They are the first to enter the cabin. Julia looks out her window and then steams up the glass with her breath, drawing a tiny, clumsy heart with her finger. Then Kyle takes a nap. Awakening from her nap, she realizes that Julia has disappeared from her seat. Kyle tries to ask other passengers, but none recalls seeing her. A flight attendant suggests that Julia might be playing with children her age. Kyle walks down the aisle, trying to find her, but still finds no sign of Julia. Kyle continues to look around with growing unease. She rechecks their row, where they'd fallen asleep, and finds the one-armed bear under the blanket, but no Julia. That's strange. Julia wouldn't go anywhere without her bear. Then she contacts a flight attendant, Stephanie, to help her find Julia. Stephanie agrees to help and makes an announcement about a missing child. However, to her surprise, Stephanie later tells her there is no record of her daughter boarding the flight. Kyle is confused. She is certain her daughter was there with her, so she tries to prove it by showing her boarding pass. However, Kyle is unable to locate Julia's boarding pass. So discovers that her daughter's backpack is missing from the overhead bin, which is improbable because Julia couldn't have reached up there by herself. She's not tall enough. Observing the situation, a sky marshal, Gene Carson, begins to monitor her while she's searching for her daughter. Kyle demands to see the captain, Marcus Rich, to involve him in the search for her daughter. Upon learning that there's no record of her daughter boarding the flight, the captain inquires if Kyle is currently taking any medication. Kyle mentions that she was using sleeping pills to manage anxiety following her husband's recent death. She further reveals that her husband died falling from their roof 6 days ago, which she refuses to accept as suicide. The captain and other crew members suspect that Kyle may have been affected by her husband's death and imagine bringing her daughter aboard. Despite this, Kyle insists on conducting a thorough search for Julia. Captain Rich reluctantly agrees and instructs the crew to conduct a comprehensive search. The cabin lights are switched on, and an announcement is made instructing all passengers to remain seated. Stephanie descends to the avionics section to search, but still, no 4-year-old girls are found. While Pratt is occupied with the search, she notices an Egyptian man. She confronts him as she vaguely recognizes him from somewhere. Struggling to recall, Kyle's mind feels too jumbled at the moment. Kyle then requests the captain to search for Julia in the cargo hold, but Captain Rich refuses, expressing frustration that all flight attendants are preoccupied with the search for a child they believe was never on board, neglecting other passengers. Kyle reacts poorly to this and rushes toward the Egyptian man, accusing him of kidnapping her daughter, recalling seeing him last night, peering into her daughter's bedroom. The man becomes irritated at being accused. Then he presents evidence of his hotel receipt, proving he was nowhere near her apartment. Chaos erupts. Kyle pressures the man to confess, leading to a scuffle. Carson, fed up with her behavior, comments that her husband's death now seems more understandable. Spending a couple of hours with her, even he starts to feel overwhelmed. Shortly after, Captain Marcus receives a wire from the hospital in Berlin stating that Julia was with her father when he fell off the roof and also succumbed to internal injuries. Now, the crew believes she is experiencing delusions. Kyle vehemently denies it, insisting that Julia is still alive and on the plane. Carson now perceives Kyle as a threat for fabricating such a story, so he restrains her with handcuffs and returns her to her seat. A therapist named Lisa approaches and attempts to offer comfort, causing Kyle to question her own sanity. She begins to come to terms with her daughter's death. However, she notices that a heart Julia had drawn earlier on the window beside her seat is real. Kyle becomes increasingly convinced that something strange is happening. She persuades the therapist to allow her to use the bathroom, but instead of doing so, she climbs into the upper compartment and sabotages the aircraft's electronics, triggering the deployment of oxygen masks and disrupting lighting. Panic ensues among passengers and crew, but Carson realizes that Kyle is behind the chaos. Taking advantage of the confusion, she sneaks into a dumbwaiter and reaches the lower freight deck. There, she finds her husband's casket and unlocks it. Suspecting Julia is inside, but discovers only her husband's body. Carson locates her, restrains her with handcuffs, and escorts her back, announcing that the flight will make an emergency stopover at Goose Bay Airport, where she will be apprehended. As she is escorted to her seat, applause breaks out among the passengers. The applause spreads, filling the deck, while some passengers, including the Egyptian, stare at her. Kyle reaches the back row and sits down. She makes a final plea to Carson that they need to search the plane upon landing. Carson considers for a moment, then decides to speak with the captain. However, instead of speaking with the captain, he secretly proceeds to the freight deck, where he discovers 2 explosives and a detonator concealed in David's, Kyle's husband, casket. He then descends to the avionics section and affixes the explosives to the side of the platform, revealing Julia, who is sleeping. At this juncture, it is unveiled that Carson has orchestrated all of this. Carson and Stephanie have colluded to hijack the aircraft for a $50 million ransom and incriminate Kyle due to her familiarity with the plane. They abducted Julia to coerce Kyle into unlocking the casket where Carson placed the explosives and detonator. Carson informs the captain that Kyle is a hijacker and threatens to detonate the explosives unless the airline transfers $50 million into a bank account. Subsequently, Carson confides in a perturbed Stephanie that he intends to detonate the plane, resulting in the death of the unconscious Julia, and frame Kyle with the detonator in her hand. Kyle remains incredulous about everything that has transpired. She nervously gazes out of the window as the plane prepares to land. Other passengers are bewildered by the emergency landing. Following the landing, the passengers disembark from the aircraft. As the captain departs, Kyle confronts him, prompting an angry declaration from the captain that the ransom has been paid. Kyle is bewildered by this revelation. Soon, she realizes that Carson is behind the scheme. He capitalizes on the situation to manipulate the truth, portraying Kyle as a terrorist. Acknowledging this truth, Kyle decides to exploit the role of hijacker, ordering Carson to remain on board while instructing the crew to evacuate. Carson hesitates, but he apprehends that if he refuses, the charade will be exposed as his doing. As soon as the plane's door is shut, Kyle incapacitates Carson with a fire extinguisher, restrains him to a rail with handcuffs, and retrieves the detonator from his pocket. Stephanie emerges from hiding. Carson regains consciousness. He pursues Kyle, firing shots until she barricades herself in the cockpit. She opens a hatch door to the plane's attic and tosses out a binder to mislead him. Carson hears the thud upstairs and departs. Kyle emerges and encounters a remorseful Stephanie. She strikes her, causing her to panic and hastily flee the plane. Kyle persists in searching for her daughter in the avionics, where she locates Julia unconscious. She immediately embraces her and carries her. Carson soon follows, and while searching, he divulges that he murdered her husband to smuggle the explosives inside his casket, knowing that it would not be scanned at the checkpoint. Kyle promptly transports Julia into the aircraft's non-combustible hold, clutching the detonator. Carson fires at her as she seals the door. Shielded by the non-combustible walls of the hold, she detonates the explosives, destroying the plane and killing Carson. The passengers and crew witness the explosion in astonishment. Moments later, Kyle emerges with her daughter. As Kyle brings her daughter onto the tarmac, the passengers are shocked to realize that she had been telling the truth all along. The following morning, at the airport terminal, Captain Rich approaches and apologizes to Kyle for his skepticism. Stephanie is escorted away by the FBI in handcuffs, while an agent informs them that the director of the Berlin mortuary has also been apprehended. Kyle carries Julia through the crowd of passengers who come to realize the truth. All are stunned and somewhat remorseful for not believing her. Before loading her daughter into a van to take them away, Julia wakes up and sleepily asks, "Are we there yet?" as they prepare to depart. The final scene shows the Egyptian passenger assisting in picking up her bag as a gesture of respect and forgiveness. If you like the video, consider subscribing the channel. Thank you.